Hello, everybody. I'm really, really glad to be here among you, remotely somewhat, at the Collaborators conference. And I want to note that this community, which once existed in the iteration of the Theology and Peace Conference, has served me well as a community of insight, as a kind of to me, holy resource of thinking through who we are in the world, how to dwell more righteously and thoughtfully within it. And I'm really, really grateful that I get to be in on the act this year. I will note that the title of my talk is Beloved Community and Guilty Pleasures and Robot Soft Exorcism. Those are strange sayings, especially that last one, but I think it's going to be clear what I'm up to with something like Robot Soft Exorcism before we're done. And of course, we'll be able to talk about these things. To begin with Beloved Community, I pick up the phrase beloved community from Congressman John Lewis, from the Reverend James Lawson, who is most famously known as the architect of the Nashville lunch counter sit-ins of 1960. And with beloved community, I'm given a phrase that includes the church, but which also includes all morally serious people. And beloved community functions as a kind of abstraction or umbrella with which to name really everyone potentially, because if we believe that we're all children of God, or that we are all infinitely valuable bearers of God's image, beloved community doesn't just name people who have chosen to be nonviolent. It also names people who are on the other side of violence. It names people who are so estranged from themselves that they behave violently or act out of their trauma in a toxic way. So with beloved community, I think of that as an aspirational self-description, but also an invitation in the way that the body of Christ is an invitation, and the way civilization itself is something of an invitation. For people who have been brought up with toxic conceptions of God, beloved community can be difficult, because if we have a toxic conception of God, we're prone to think that our own violence or our own urge to correct or control others is somehow of God. So, early on in this talk, I want to try to dispel one conception of God with care and a degree of humor, but also a little bit of horror, I have to say. I'm going to share a story with you that is a little like a Twilight Zone episode and a little bit like a thought experiment. The story goes this way. There is a small town in which community, neighbors, the citizens of the town are fond of each other. They are good to each other, and they inquire into one another's lives. But there is also a kind of fear and anxiety among these townspeople that often comes down to a figure that they all refer to as Uncle Ben. Uncle Ben shows up in their exchanges with sayings like, isn't Uncle Ben good? Aren't we all grateful for Uncle Ben? Alongside those phrases, there's also a kind of straining of conversation toward Uncle Ben whenever difficulties are grappled with. For instance, if someone is sick, or if tragedy befalls, that will be acknowledged. But the townspeople will nevertheless say, it just goes to show that we all need Uncle Ben. Or all that means is that we need to trust Uncle Ben more. Similarly, a sunset or excellent weather, which might be commented upon, is also pulled back to Uncle Ben. Everything is thanks to Uncle Ben. Within this town, once a week, in the largest building in the town, a bell rings, and whatever anybody is up to comes to a close, and everyone wanders over to the structure. And they go in, and there's donuts, and there's coffee, and they talk about everything, but they do also talk about Uncle Ben. There's this perfunctory obligation to bring Uncle Ben into things. And then another bell sounds, and everyone in the house makes their way to a stairwell, which leads down to a basement. And in that basement, there are metal chairs, all facing a big black furnace. And next to that big black furnace is a very large man in overalls with his back to everyone in the chairs. And the man within the image that I'm seeing is so connected to this furnace that it is as if this furnace and the man are one. Everyone takes a seat in silence. The man is silent. He has yet to turn to confront those who have gathered around him. And as you can perhaps guess, the man is Uncle Ben. Out of the silence, Uncle Ben turns around and fixes an angry stare on everyone in the room and asks everyone in the room, "Am I good?" To which everyone in the room says, "You alone are good, Uncle Ben." And he says, "Am I worthy of praise?" To which everyone in unison says, "You alone are worthy of praise, Uncle Ben." And then Uncle Ben says, "Do you love me?" And everyone says in unison, "We love you and you alone, Uncle Ben." Uncle Ben then says, "Well, you better love me, or I'm going to put you in here forever." He opens the furnace. There is fire in the furnace. And everyone in their seats, when they look into the fire, see some variation of themselves and others in pain, in torment, and in anguish, unending anguish, forever. He closes the furnace. He turns his back to them, and they all walk up the stairs silently and return to their lives, doing the best they can with what they have. But of course, a very subtle fear is interwoven even within their joys, even within their affection for one another. A quiet desperation is intertwined, not only in all of their own stories, but their own memories, their experience, their attempts to hold one another dear. This concludes the Uncle Ben Thought Experiment Twilight Zone episode. I will say right away that Uncle Ben, as a conception of God, is a false God, is an unbiblical God, is a God in whom there is no love, but only contempt, derision, and a kind of unending source of self-hatred that many of us, I will say for myself, has been a part of my own theological life. I will note, too, that this Uncle Ben story, or what the Uncle Ben story is trying to get at, is not unrelated to William Blake's attempt to think justly of God. And William Blake, for instance, and others, have referred to that conception of God as Nobo Daddy, as in a God that is nobody's loving father, nobody's daddy. I would say that the Uncle Ben version of God is a kind of transmogrification, a making into a monster, the God of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Jesus. I also want to note, and this sort of speaks to our concerns of becoming and embodying beloved community, that the Uncle Ben analogy for God does not even work if we try to impose Jesus between ourselves and Uncle Ben. There's a way of thinking about the meaning of Jesus' life and death, which suggests that the Uncle Ben God hates sin, is a God of judgment, and has to end it or destroy it. And upon firing the hell cannon of God's righteousness, Jesus, who is also part of God, breaks away from Uncle Ben and outruns the fire of the hell cannon and jumps in between ourselves and hellfire in a kind of no. That too is a popular conception of God, which to my mind does not and cannot work biblically. Because, for one thing, it leaves God, the Father, awfully Uncle Ben-like, awfully out of control, and awfully content with imposing trauma, pain, and everlasting agony on God's creation. So this is a very long-winded way of offering a different formula for thinking through the meaning of Jesus. But here is one formula, and here's the formula that I want to replace it with. False Uncle Ben formula. Jesus is our protection from God's terror. I would like to replace it with the following saying. Jesus is God's response to our terror. And in Jesus, God is reconciling the whole world to God's self. And in Jesus, God is making peace with us. I'll repeat it. Jesus is not our protection from God's terror. Jesus is God responding lovingly and patiently and instructively to our terror, to our violence. In the attempt to be, for ourselves and others, beloved community, it's important we have to go deep with all of the barriers that we're confronted with when it comes to love of others and love of self. So beloved community starting point is addressing those wicked, idolatrous, false conceptions of God that are sometimes mistaken for Christian teaching. Not with that out of the way, because I know none of this is ever out of the way. Uncle Ben, if you were to ask me, well, are you done with that? I don't know that I'll ever be done with it. If Israel means striving with God to be part of the biblical tradition is to enter into Israel, is to enter into that struggle, just as Jacob wrestled an angel the night before confronting, meeting, and trying to make peace with his brother Esau. That struggle with toxic conceptions of self, of God, and others is an ongoing thing. And of course, Israel means strives with God, but in Arabic, jihad also means struggle. And it is said within Islamic tradition that the greater jihad is the inner jihad, is dealing with that, dealing with yourself, dealing with your own heart, dealing with your own imagination. I will now move into the guilty pleasure section of this presentation and note that within this clearing that I'm trying to do, we can have hopefully right perception of ourself and others, and we will be less prone, hopefully, to view our own affections, our own enthusiasms, our own obsessions as guilty pleasures. I like to speak of guilty pleasures as something that that has information in them. If I love Breaking Bad, or if I love Kendrick Lamar, or if I love Mad Men or Game of Thrones or Walking Dead, all of these pop culture artifacts have something for me. There's a reason that I want to watch Better Call Saul. Whatever I want to binge watch. There's information in the desire to binge watch. And with that, I'd like to draw from James Allison's work in terms of viewing ourselves and others, even cultural material, properly. And James Allison, in Raising Abel, the Covery of the Eschatological Imagination, takes us to Peter's struggle in the book of Acts as he is being made to see in a vision that which he thought of as unclean and inappropriate was actually holy, was actually sacred. I'm just going to read a part aloud here. What Peter is saying when he affirms that God has revealed to him not to call anyone profane or impure is that the heavenly counter-history, the subversion from within of the story of this world, has an indispensable grammatical rule that no discrimination against any sort of repugnant person can resist the crucible of learning not to call them profane or impure. So I want to highlight that phrase, crucible of learning, and argue, especially in the COVID era, that the time we spend with Netflix or HBO or deep diving on music is not a distraction from devotional work or a distraction from that which is holy, but is actually a deep dive into our own experience. Kendrick Lamar has said in his To Pimp a Butterfly album, "My rights, my wrongs, I'll write till I'm right with God." Now there's a W-R-I-T-E in there. My rights, my wrongs, I'll write till I'm right with God. I will write out. I will take notes. I will ask myself why I love what I love and why I am revolted when I'm revolted. John Keats says that, the poet John Keats says that he believes in nothing more than the holiness of the heart's affections. Now that doesn't mean that our hearts are never desperately wicked. It doesn't mean that we're never twisted in our perception. But there is something holy about our natural affections. And James Allison, I think, in this passage, about this crucible of learning, which is a little like Israel, which is a little bit like jihad, in which we do a deep dive into our own dreams and our own hopes, is part of what Beloved Community calls us to. I have some more from James Allison. The story of heaven, we could say the story of the reign of God, is the story of how we learn not to call anyone profane or impure, so that a story is created in which there are, in fact, no impure or profane people, where not even disgusting people consider themselves disgusting, but rather where we have learned to disbelieve and to help them disbelieve in their own repugnancy, in their own self-loathing. I like to argue that toxic personalities are traumatized personalities, and that downward shame spiral of self-loathing, I would argue, is at work in our politics, is at work in white supremacist terror, which is often state-sponsored, and is at work in all manner of systemic evil. Allison continues, I keep to words like disgusting because it seems to me more useful for our understanding. What Peter saw in his vision seemed to him, according to kosher law, disgusting, and it was so unnecessarily. Our question as we receive, I'm going to change the language here, the apocalyptic imagination must be, who are for me the repugnant beasts, or for whom am I a repugnant beast? James Allison says, in this way, by asking ourselves difficult questions about what repulses us and strikes us as disgusting, in this way, we'll be able to begin to knock down the same wall as Peter. So that wall between the clean and the unclean, the liberal and the conservative, however we want to do that, the secular and the sacred, the believer and the non-believer. I think that Allison is inviting us to heed Peter's dream vision of beloved community, in which those divisions don't dictate our thinking or our perception any longer. Within this clearing, I can also have room for more admission, personal admission, of my own complicity in wrongdoing and my own tendency to demonize others. I believe it is the case that we demonize when we don't know what to do with our despair. But we are less prone to demonize when we see within ourselves this struggle, this animus that wants to put people in their place, that wants to correct people. As many of you know, when we speak of mimetic theory, imitative desire, we speak of insight that comes to us not just in Shakespeare and Dostoevsky and Facebook algorithms, but we're speaking of an ancient knowledge, intuition, insight. We're talking about good anthropology that existed for us long before the discipline of anthropology arrived. And my hope is, with this question of guilty pleasures, loving what we love, looking for information in what we love, I hope that this too can provide a clearing of perception in which we are less in denial about our borrowing of others. James Allison, maybe famously for y'all, but famously for me, said that it's natural if I have a friend named Todd who starts wearing green corduroys, and I like those green corduroys, and I buy myself some green corduroys, and then someone approaches me and says, "Ooh, I like those green corduroys. They remind me of Todd's green corduroys." I might say, depending on the state of my heart, "Really? Huh, I never noticed that Todd wore green corduroys." Alternately, I might be able to say, "Oh, I know. I bought these green corduroys because I admire Todd and I want to be like him. I am copying him right now. I love and admire Todd so much that I look for ways of bringing his style, his eloquence, his way of being into the world, into my own. Similarly, even when we speak, we are often borrowing the sound bites, the language of others. All eloquence, we might say, is borrowed. And if we're willing to acknowledge the borrowing as just the transmission of gift, insight, style, hooray. But if we live in denial of it, if our own desire to be original and to not owe anything to anybody has us blinding others and sometimes even ourselves to our own vulnerability, to our own appropriation and purloining of other people's thoughts, that's a problem which can escalate into violence even. I know this is Girard 101, but I wanted to review this. Jesus saw this happening among the people who had it out for him and who were ready to bring him down because of the insights he was bringing and all the ways those insights disturbed the status quo. Woe to you, scribes. This is Matthew chapter 23, beginning with verse 27. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you are like whitewashed tombs, which on the outside look beautiful, but inside they are full of the bones of the dead and of all kinds of filth. So you also on the outside look righteous to others, but inside you are full of hypocrisy and lawlessness. Of course, note that Jesus is something of a scribe himself, insofar that he commits to memory the imagery of the prophet Isaiah. Jesus himself is borrowing from what he was taught by his mother, by John the Baptist, by others in his community. But the way he holds it is different from the way the scribes and Pharisees he's addressing in this moment hold it. There's more. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you build the tombs of the prophets and decorate the graves of the righteous. And you say, if we had lived in the days of our ancestors, we would not have taken part with them in shedding the blood of the prophets. Thus you testify against yourselves that you are descendants of those who murdered the prophets. Fill up then the measure of your ancestors. So this is an interesting moment because he's confronting the scribes and Pharisees who celebrate the prophets while saying, were we alive back then, we would never have killed the prophets. But Jesus is pushing it harder and saying, you are the very people who are wanting to kill the prophets among you right now, but you cannot live with that admission. That thing of denying our own proneness to complicity in evil is kind of the kernel that, it is, I think, the rare, narrow road that leads to life. And the path of destruction, which is wide, is a best-selling ball game. If we're going to be people of beloved community, we have to see within ourselves the very animus, denial, fear that leads others to demonize, so that we don't fall into that cycle of despair, resorting to demonization, resorting to violence. Jesus tries to break it down here, but he's astute enough to kind of note the inner psychology of those who say, I would never. If I were alive in those days, I would not cooperate with Jim Crow. I would not be one who fire hoses nonviolent protesters. Kurt Vonnegut is a rare bird in American letters, and I even want to say in sacred history, because Kurt Vonnegut famously, Slaughterhouse-Five was his effort to deal with this, was an American soldier in World War II and experienced the firebombing of Dresden as a prisoner of war in Germany. He knew all too well the evil that men do, but he also knew that Nazi Germany followed the Geneva Convention strictly enough that he survived the firebombing of Dresden in an underground bunker as German women and children were burned alive. He was then made to be part of the cleanup. So he saw the charred bodies of the victims of Allied forces. With that kind of experience in Kurt Vonnegut's personal history, he took to writing science fiction. And he gave us, in a work like Mother Night, this saying, which I want to place before you, and place alongside the wisdom of Jesus. We are what we pretend to be, so we must be very careful about what we pretend to be. Vonnegut offers us this, to my mind, sacred proverb about pretense, about imitation. We have to be really careful about who we admire, who we normalize, who we applaud, because we become what we applaud. We become what we abide. We even become what we mediate. If I platform a voice for money, or if I platform a political figure on my Twitter feed, I think I become what I platform. I don't think I can say, I just did that to promote that for money. I think we become what we promote. So we've really got to watch it in these very heady days of escalated animus of technology, which I believe Vonnegut would agree amplifies our capacity for the demonic. But it can also amplify righteousness. It can amplify unheard stories. It can amplify the plight of the victims. A little more from Vonnegut. He says, if I'd been born in Germany, I suppose I would have been a Nazi, bopping Jews and gypsies and Poles around, leaving boots sticking out of snowbanks, warming myself with my secretly virtuous insides. So it goes. Don't miss that. Like Jesus, skewering manipulative people in his own day, saying, you're telling yourself that you wouldn't have killed the prophets. You would have. Here's Kurt Vonnegut saying, it's not only possible that I would have been a Nazi, I probably would have been a Nazi. And not only would I have been a Nazi, I would have warmed myself on my secretly virtuous insides. I feel like that. I don't think it's going to be out of plaque, but secretly virtuous insides really gets at something in terms of our own tendency to legitimate ourselves rather than be people of confession or repentance, holding it all out with open hands. With insights like these, we are able to think more honestly about ourselves and confess our proneness to portray ourselves falsely in order to feel better about ourselves. This too is essential to beloved community. Because if when I'm looking at someone I think of as an aggressor, I don't in any way see myself in this process of demonization. I cannot be an agent of healing. I cannot heal that which I'm not willing to see myself as a part of. And beloved community names the common humanity that makes it possible to confront someone else's aggression with a deep awareness of my own aggression. This takes us to robot soft exorcism. And with robot soft exorcism, I'm going to turn to Ephesians chapter 6. I hope this doesn't feel like too much of a stretch for anyone. But Paul, in an effort to name systemic evil, gives us some imagery. And it is this. We have the language of putting on the whole armor of God. But then in Ephesians 6:12, Paul says, "For our struggle is not against enemies of blood and flesh, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the cosmic powers of this present darkness, against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly places." So the big takeaway there is our struggle, our Israel, our jihad, is not against flesh and blood. It's not against actual people. It's against systems. It's against the infrastructure of bad ideas that we are each born into and that we each inherit in one way or another. If I am looking at a state trooper who has been ordered to rough me up if I try to step into the state capitol, it's very important that I don't personalize the jihad of the state trooper who needs his or her health insurance and who needs to be able to feed his or her family. If I can look at the state trooper as someone who is locked into as flesh and blood, who, like me, is stuck in a particular script, it's going to be easier for me to make this a human exchange, even if the state trooper's job is to forcibly keep me out of the state capitol and possibly cite me or possibly arrest me. We have resources for these confrontations with principalities and powers throughout the history of the civil rights movement and in our own day, every day. It happens that in perhaps every major American city right now, there are people protesting against white supremacist terror, which puts them into an Israel-wrestle jihad type confrontation with real human beings whose job is to protect, for instance, a statue of Andrew Jackson or a statue of Christopher Columbus. They've been told to protect property, and they are often the victims of the poor leadership of presidents and governors and mayors who are not giving them clear directives. So all of this to say, this is a very real struggle afoot, even now. My language for this, and here is my term, it is robot soft exorcism. This is my explication of the Ephesians passage. If, in order to maintain my overhead, food on the table, mortgage, all of that, I exist within a giant robot called the United States government, or the Tennessee Highway State Troopers, or Facebook, or Google, or MGM. These are robots. These are principalities. These are corporations. These are institutions in which people make a living. If I am within one of these, I'm in a giant robot. I'm at the command console of a giant robot whereby I earn my living. My hope is that if that robot is crushing human beings in order to generate income, my hope is that someone outside of the robot might look up into the eye socket of that giant robot and see me at the command console and cry out to me and let me know that what I'm doing to make a living is having horrible impact, repercussions, unintended consequences on people outside of the robot. I would also hope that upon spying me, a real human being in that eye socket, that they would yell to me and offer me opportunities to climb outside of that robot and to no longer be implicated in systemic evil, in systemic violence. I am in a robot called Belmont University, where I am employed. I am also in a robot in the sense that I have a social media account on Twitter. And I do and say things on Twitter that, if I'm not careful, can create pain and trauma for other people in their robots, whatever it might be. I know this is quite the stretch because I'm giving you a robot within a robot, and I'm noting that we are all parts. We all draw a living probably from some kind of robot. How to dwell meaningfully and righteously within these robots and in spite of these robots is an ongoing work of discernment. But robot soft exorcism is the technique that is at work and is available to us as we invite people to be human beings among human beings, in spite of their station, their job, their source of employment. I have a story with which I'm going to conclude about an act of robot soft exorcism that occurred in 1960 in downtown Nashville. James Lawson, as you may know, came to Nashville after being counseled by Martin Luther King Jr. to move to Nashville to enroll at Vanderbilt Divinity and to see about being part of the integrating of the lunch counters in up till then segregated lunch counters in Nashville. You had the whites only section in a restaurant, and you had the area for the language of the time was for colored people, in the same way that you had water fountains for colored people. James Lawson, a student remotely of Gandhi, of Howard Thurman, of any number of folks, trained American Baptist Bible College students, John Lewis among them, Fisk students, other students in Nashville, in the work of nonviolently sitting in the whites only section, demanding service, and then waiting for law enforcement to come and drag them out of the restaurant and then wait for arrest. In order to do this well, you had to be trained in role-playing beforehand. And if you didn't believe that you had it in you to not lash out or hit back or say something that might incite violence to the people who are calling you any number of words, your job was to not try that day because you could wreck the whole thing. Similarly, in Nashville right now and in Ferguson years ago, in all of these instances, you can have 1,000 nonviolent protesters. And if one person joins that crowd and throws a brick through a window, it is suddenly a riot, according to media sources. And it does give governors and mayors and whomever coverage to crack down violently on a nonviolent demonstration. So the story, still headed to the exchange. James Lawson was there in 1960 to remind the students of their commitment to the teachings of Jesus specifically, and to tell the gathering white citizens of Nashville who were trying to rough them up, these students are committed to nonviolence. You might strike them, but they will not strike back, and you can deal with yourself on whether or not that's a courageous or heroic thing to punch someone who is honor-bound to not hit back. So Lawson was there to mediate, and out of this, a man with a leather jacket pushed his way to the front of the crowd and spat in James Lawson's face and called him the N-word. James Lawson looked at the man and said, as the spit was rolling down his face, and said, "Do you have a handkerchief?" The man, caught off guard, produced a handkerchief from his pocket and handed it to James Lawson. And as James Lawson was wiping the spit off of his face, he noticed the guy had a leather jacket on, sort of James Dean motorcycle-y kind of thing. He saw a motorcycle behind the man and said, "Is that your motorcycle?" To which the man said, "Yes, it is." And James Lawson said, "What's the horsepower on that motorcycle?" And within a few seconds, James Lawson and the aggressor are talking about motorcycles. And within a few more seconds, the man who had spat in James Lawson's face looked around and said, "Is there any way I can help you folks with what you're doing?" It was a complete disarming, an exorcism, I want to say, that occurred in that moment. And a man who knows what his narrative was at that point in time, but within seconds he was interested in changing his narrative. And of course, as we know, repentance is metanoia, is turning your mind around. I of course want to note that there are others who tried that kind of thing and it did not work. But it did work in this one moment, in which James Lawson was prepared to say something like that. I took a nonviolence class at Vanderbilt with Reverend Lawson, and I was able to ask him, how do you become someone to whom it would occur to respond that way to an angry, violent person? And he said, well, you have to keep in your mind an imagery of infinite possibility. I was so glad I was there to hear those words, because I honestly feel that it was a little like being on hand to write words down when any prophet or when Jesus himself drops on us a lyrical, eloquent aphorism with which to survive a toxic, violent terror age. So I will leave you with that. You have to keep in your mind an imagery of infinite possibility, and I give that to you as an oracle of beloved community.